So I'm Rosemary Dean, the curator here at Te Toi Uku, and I'll just introduce you briefly to John Heap, who worked at Crown Lynn from 1960 to 1979. 78. And part of that time he was assistant factory manager. Is that right? So he knows all the ins and outs of the glazes and clays and production methods. So here we go. John, thanks.
Hi.
Also, sorry, I've got to say, we're just going to leave questions to the end. We're going to have a question and answer session at the end, just to make it smoother.
Good day. Nice to see so many friends of Crown Lynn here today. As Rosemary said, my name is John Heap. I started at Crown Lynn in the late 1960 and commenced there in the work study department, doing work study, method study, implementation of the bonus incentive scheme, setting work standards for all the operations throughout the whole place. So I got a fairly good understanding from the clay preparation right through to the finished goods and dispatch as to how the factory operated. And during the time I was there, there were some really good times and the factory was extremely busy. My first recollections were, I came from a farm in Albany, and over the outside side of the North Shore, it was a matter of catching a bus through to the city and then onto another bus, and there were two buses that left the bottom of town and came out to New Lynn. And there was McRae's buses, which are the green ones, run by that mad guy McRae, and the other were the commercial buses, the blue buses. And both had their depots right at the entrance where the Lynmore car park is now. In those days there was no Lynmore, and Totra Avenue ran up past Crown Lynn and the brickworks. My early recollections were walking along Totra Avenue, the rusty buildings where the pipes were drying from the pipeworks, the tall brick chimneys discharging a high level of SO4 sulfuric acid from the stacks, which would rust all of the workers' car bonnets and bodies out in next to no time. And there was no Lynmore. New Lynn was just a small area, and when the train pulled in the morning from Waitakere, people exited the train, walked their way up to Crown Lynn, and Crown Lynn and the brickworks were certainly the biggest employers in West Auckland by miles. The only other one that came close was Cambridge Clothing. In New Lynn at that stage, coming across the Wow Bridge, we had Crumb Brick and Tile on the left hand side there, run by the Crumb family, a good family, grew up in West Auckland, produced quality pipes. We had Glenburn Brickworks over in Wolverton Street there, producing a quality brick. The Glenburn brick is recognised because of its earthy colours and textures. Where we are here today on this little street was the Gardeners Brickworks, and across in Rankin Avenue was Amalgamated Brick and Pipe, further on Crown Lynn Potteries. I'll just go here. Many of you, I guess, would have visited Crown Lynn at some stage. There's some people here who've actually worked there and know as much or more about the place than I do. The Crown Lynn factory captivated a real sense of attention when going through the front doors. The sound of the air valves hissing and exhausting on the glaze machines, the drone of the fans, the atomising fans on the kilns, and the clanking of crockery and tableware at the grading areas and the distinctive smell of the kilns firing clay and glazed products. The gloss buzzers were grinding plates, or later air chipping them off, or there was Fred Hoffman's roar or laugh, depending on how he felt that day. There were the fruit kilns discharging molten glass into the water, which was a spectacular thing for any visitors to look at. And then down the bottom of the plant were the huge ball mills rumbling away, grinding up the local clays, and they were running 18 hours a day, which was the normal cycle for reducing the raw clay to a liquid slurry. The place was just a buzz of activity, and there was an air of urgency and action in every department. Where it all began, founded by Tom Clark, who convinced his father to advance him some money. He was working at that stage as a young man in the brickworks. It was the end of the war, and he wanted some money to start producing some tableware to substitute imports. He got the money and from his father, and with a small group of hard-working men who had no idea what they were in for, worked with Tom in what we call the old factory, later to be the technical ceramics department, where they set up a small clay preparation plant. They had some hand jiggers producing flatware, some hand operated jiggers producing hollowware, cups and bowls. Tom had a good knowledge of local clays available through the technical people at the Brick and Pipe Works and other places. The body they first produced was not a white body, it was a cream coloured body because of the ball clays having a reasonably high iron content. One particular clay was the hide clay, which came from Otago, a very, very good quality plastic clay, but again, not white firing. Tom single-handedly created an industrial empire with manufacturing plants in New Zealand, England and the Philippines. Those early years were a real struggle with limited resources, learning by mistakes and sheer hard work with long hours. While China, the country, had made ceramics for many hundreds of years, the Stoke-on-Trent region in England is where Crown Lynn looked to for manufacturing methods and technical know-how. The large potteries on Stoke-on-Trent, however, operated with huge advantages to Crown Lynn. Very few of the potteries on Stoke-on-Trent would have their own clay preparation department, or glaze preparation department, or colour blending department. All of those services were supplied by companies down the road who specialised in clay, be it an earthenware, a bone china, or a porcelain body. The glazes could be trucked in and brought in liquid form, ready for application on a daily or weekly basis. Crown Lynn did not enjoy any of those services. We had to make do ourselves, and everything had to be done in-house. And in the Stoke-on-Trent area, experts were just down the road, and you could call on them for all of the technical knowledge that you required if there was a problem. The potteries on Stoke-on-Trent specialised in, for example, coffee mugs only, a limited range of dinnerware, plates and cups, cast artware and hollowware. None of the potteries in Stoke-on-Trent ever produced the range that came out of the pottery down the road at Crown Lynn. None of them. And I don't believe any pottery in Stoke-on-Trent produced two different clay bodies. Crown Lynn had the earthenware body and our vitrified or porcelain body. And both of those two clay bodies were fired in the same kilns, which meant adjusting the flux component so we got the right degree of vitrification. The vitrified ware, being non-porous, was specific to the hotel and institutional wear. A little bit about the processes. The clay preparation department, we bought in clays, the raw clays, and they were initially broken down in the tube mills to a fine slurry. The various parts were blended to form either the earthenware or the vitrified body, and the liquid slurry was then filter pressed under high pressure through filter plates and filter cloths where the water was extracted, and we left with big filter cakes. They were then fed into to the pug mill, which was a big auger, the same as we got in the dairy company for producing butter. It blended and de-aired the clay. De-airing the clay increased the plasticity, and initially the clay was produced in block form, where it would sit in the clay storeroom to mature a little bit. It was then put through the pug mill again into columns for the making machines, be it flatware, which was nice big round columns which would be cut off for producing the plates on moulds, or cups which would be made. The cups were in a semi-automatic jigger produced on the inside. There was also the products that were made from liquid clay or casting, and these included cup handles. Every cup handle had to be cast in a mould, a round mould, normally 20-something cup handles per mould, and it was filled from the inside. The plaster absorbed the moisture, as in with cream jug or any artware. The plaster of Paris would absorb the moisture from the slit until a particular thickness was formed on the inside of the plaster mould, at which time the mould was emptied, the mould was taken apart, and the cast item could be removed. At that stage in the making process for cups and flatware, the product came off the dryers in what they call a leather hard form, so it could be fettled. The edges could be rounded off. The surface of the plate or the cup could be sponged smooth. It was then, the product was on racks trucked above the tunnel kiln. This is a tunnel kiln car, where it would dry from the heat and the recirculating fans until it was reduced to a specific moisture content. It would then be brought down and loaded on these kiln cars for the initial firing through the tunnel kiln. The tunnel kiln fired both products of earthenware and vitrified product, and was a very, very efficient kiln. Coming out of the kiln, the product was referred to as bisque ware, unfired. I'll now touch on a few of the different decorating techniques. The first on greenware was slip banding. I'm not sure where that is, slip banding, but carousel is one example here of slip banding, where the greenware had colours brushed applied to it. It was then fired in the biscuit form and glazed. So that was a totally underglazed greenware decoration. We had underglazed stamping, where the bisque ware had a rubber stamp which picked up an oil-based colour from a rubber belt and transferred it onto the plate. And one example of that decoration is Tam O'Shanter, which was a green and orange decoration. Also in the underglaze method of decoration was the underglaze printing on machines that were built at Crown Lynn, and they were referred to as a Murray Curvix machine. The initial one was imported from England, was stripped down and copied and modified, and a far superior machine emerged from the engineering department at Crown Lynn, and this did all of the underglaze printing. And it involved a copper engraving, which was hard chromed, and the copper engraving would travel under a colour applicator, and a nylon blade would sweep the colour into the indentations of the engraving, and the engraving would then pass under a gelatine bomb, a bit like a boob, which would come down and pick up the ink, and then when the carriage came back, would transfer that, press down onto the plate and transfer that onto the plate. And the example is, that's Eco, that was a black print, it's got a red translucent glaze over it. That there is a typical underglaze print. Thousands of pieces were produced on the Murray Curvix machines in flatware every week. There was also a huge range of colour glazes applied direct to the biscuitware, and you would have all seen the olive greens and the caramels and the yellows and the teal blues. Cups were dipped into the liquid colour. Flatware or plates were sprayed. All of the plates that were glazed, either a colour glaze on the face or a clear glaze on the face and back, were then loaded into what we called ceramic cranks, where they were supported on 3 ceramic pins. The cups all had a rim on the bottom, which was, the glaze was white clear on a felt belt, and they were placed on ceramic sillimanite slabs and fired in the glazed kilns. So the cups had a dry foot. The plates were supported on 3 pins on the back, on 3 ceramic pins. We also had in-glaze decorations, which were fired at the high temperature. We had combinations of glazed granules, colour glaze, underglaze prints, colour applied on glaze in the case of one decoration, Fiesta, where drops of colour were applied on. There were decorations which had a fabric texture. One of the decorations that I recall as fabric. This was clear glazed and went further after gloss firing to the decorating department where it had a transfer onto it. So that was an underglaze plus an on-glaze transfer. So things, there was just a multitude of different decorating techniques to meet the market demands of for the chain stores. And in those days when I started, there was Mackenzie's, Woolworths and Farmers Trading Company. Part of the success of Crown Lynn was the establishment of certain stock decorations which carried full replaceability. And there were a certain number of stock decorations, like Autumn Splendour, which comes to mind, or Echo was another one. And these were sold to the Crown Lynn franchised shops throughout New Zealand and in Australia, where Mrs. Housewife could go and buy the 20 or 36 piece dinner set, and if she broke a cup or a plate, she could go back and get a replacement of 1 or 2 pieces, whatever she wanted. And this was Crown Lynn's strength, that Mrs. Housewife in New Zealand could get full replacement of any stock pattern decoration. And in the case of one particular decoration like Autumn Splendour, that was an enduring decoration that went on for 20, 30 years. Unlike the imported set that might have come out of Japan, Sri Lanka or England, if Mrs. Housewife had a 20-piece set and a cup was broken, a plate was broken, well, you had to put up with what you were left with or throw the whole lot out and go and get another set. Crown Lynn also, in supplying the chain stores, if I can just go back one thing, all of the stock decorations carried a Crown Lynn backstamp. Definitely Crown Lynn. The promotional wear, which was going to the Farmers Trading Company, the Mackenzies and the Woolworths, had a variety of different backstamps. Some had Kelston on it, British made. We called ourselves British at that stage. So that gave a differentiation. When I go back into the 60s, there was also a very regulated structure in terms of the distribution of tableware in New Zealand. We had the established wholesaler, the manufacturer, the wholesaler and the retailer. The days of the wholesaler were gone when direct selling from the manufacturers started to occur. And many of the wholesalers in New Zealand died a natural death as a consequence. Crown Lynn also had sales offices and warehouses for the product in Australia, Canada and the States. And Crown Lynn product was packed to these markets. We also supplied the stock patterns into those areas where there were franchise type retailers that had access to the Crown Lynn range. And there was also the chain stores that were supplied with the promotional merchandise, like the Kmarts and others in Australia. Going on to the vitrified product, this was the institutional wear. Much of it had a monogram applied to it. That monogram was produced on a paper tissue on a badging machine with a colour which was transferred from the paper onto the bisque ware underglaze, and then the product was glazed. We also had at that stage the Government Stores Board that purchased all of the crockery for the railways, Navy, hospital boards, and negotiations would take place every year with the Government Stores Board over the range of product that they would require for those armed services, hospitals or whatever. Production at Crown Lynn plant reached a peak in the 1970s with weekly sales exceeding 400,000 pieces of saleable first quality product, plus all of the sales that were generated through the second shop at Crown Lynn, and we had other second shops in Auckland to also supply the demand. The Crown Lynn second shop was known right throughout the country. We had busloads and guided tours and a group of 6 or 7 retired gentlemen who acted as guides, showing visitors through the factory. The visit always culminated with introducing and walking them into the second shop where they could spend all their money and we could get some cash out of them. The second shop was very, very popular and also extremely profitable because we had no packaging costs, we had no distribution costs, and everyone in New Zealand who had visited Crown Lynn always went into the second shop. A lot of the products sold in the second shop was specifically glazed and decorated for the second shop. At times we were actually short of seconds and we'd run a whole lot of plain white cups because we had people coming from the local country hall that wanted 12 dozen white cups, for example, 750 shape. So these had to be, we'd rush these through in the weekend with a clean glaze on them to supply the shop. Staff numbers during the peak in the 70s, when the factory was producing 400,000 pieces a week, reached 700 employees. So it was a big operation. There were 700 people working in the factory in New Lynn. And we were certainly the biggest employer in West Auckland. There's much I've left out, omitted or forgotten with age. And to do real justice to Crown would take 6 hours. I'd like, however, to pay tribute to some of those quality and talented people in production, technical engineering and design and marketing personnel I had the pleasure of working with during my time at Crown Lynn. Crown Lynn also recruited over a 40-year period some very talented people from the UK, particularly from Stoke-on-Trent, for mould making, for decorating, for kiln firing, for glazing. And as a result, those technical people brought with them a great deal of knowledge. For some of it was a bit of a shock because they thought they were coming out to the back blocks, and in many cases we knew a bit more about the technical side and production than they did. But most of them adapted pretty well, and they were good people. In the early days, all the initial production was done on hand jiggers together with some casting. And as in the mid 70s, a major capital expenditure was undertaken with the expansion of the factory and the purchase of new, modern, well-engineered making equipment, specifically from Germany and some in from Japan. These were machines which could produce consistently at a far higher hourly output than the semi-automatic machines which we traditionally relied upon. Crown Lynn did have its own engineering workshop which developed, modified and manufactured many of the machines used in the production or glazing of the pottery. As I said, in the early years of manufacture, the basic earthenware body was off-white to cream in colour, utilising many of the local clays sourced from throughout New Zealand. And I made mention of the local ball clays, whilst very plastic in texture, contain high levels of iron, which resulted in an off-white fired body colour. Hyde ball clay from Otago being an excellent example. It was the English ball clays from Devon and the English china clays from Cornwall, which were regarded around the world as the premium, consistent and stable raw material. The sales and marketing people demanded a white body. And that for us created a lot of challenges in terms of sourcing alternative supplies of raw materials in New Zealand. Our china clay came from Pukitotra Road, just out of Waipapa on Kerikeri, and that was a Mangapararua china clay. We had a kaolin that came from Mount Somers at the head of the Rakaya Gorge in the South Island. That pit was only workable in the summer months because it was frozen over in winter, and we had to cross a river to get to it. The rock from Mount Somers was initially mined by the patients at the Sunnyside Hospital, who got the biggest size boulders you could possibly mention into these sacks. I don't know how they got them in, whether they stick the sack around the block or not, but that Mount Somers clay arrived at the pottery and was then spalled by hammer, put through a jaw crusher before it went into the ball mills. The ball mills themselves, the original ones came from the gold mining days in the Coromandel at Thames. They were lined with blocks of rock that came from Croatia, and we call those Yugoslav mill linings. And the grinding media within the mills were pebbles that came off the beaches of Belgium. The mixture of clay and water discharged it into the mills with the hatch shut. The mill was then set revolving, and it would revolve, for example, for 18 hours, in which time the grinding action of the pebbles against the Yugoslav mill linings would grind that raw clay or rock into a fine liquid slurry. And the different slurries were blended together to create either the earthenware or the porcelain body. Just some of the things that made it difficult and expensive during those early days. When the clay pit at Mangapararua for our china clay was first opened, we didn't have the luxury of being able to load it onto a truck, because to truck around New Zealand you had to have a special licence. So it had to be loaded onto first of all loaded onto a truck, and then the truck would drive to Oteria, just north of Maurua, where it would be unloaded into railway wagons. And some of that was with a Fordson tractor with a clamshell. We didn't have hydraulic excavators in those days, and there was no siding where we could actually put the hydraulic tip up on the truck and tip it directly into the wagon. Those wagons would be railed through to New Lynn up here, where Avondale Transport would remove the clay with a clamshell back up onto their trucks and then drive into the yard to put the tip up. It was all huge cost and extra handling, the risk of contamination through dirty railway wagons or whatever. Fortunately, that monopoly that the railways enjoyed in those days was extinguished, and we were able to engage road transport operators like Jackson Haulage, who would take a truck and trailer from Auckland up to Mangapararua. A front end loader would load the clay on, and we'd have it the next morning down here. At half the transport costs that we were affected with by having to use rail. A little bit on the kilns. The kilns in the 60s were all fired on light fuel oil, which is basically diesel. And the diesel burners on the kilns were replaced by natural gas burners when reticulated natural gas came into the New Lynn area. And the gas was cleaner burning, it was reliable. We didn't have to rely on tanker drivers delivering every 3 or 4 days a full tanker load of diesel into the underground storage tanks. The diesel also fired the boilers, which produced the hot water and steam for all of the dryers, and the diesel also fired the tunnel kiln, the glossed prouty kiln, and the frit kiln. Just after the war, there was one other source of fuel, and that was a gas producer. A gas producer was installed at the back of the clay preparation department, where it would produce coal gas for firing the kilns. That building subsequently became part of the clay preparation and a 3-storey tower block for blungers, etc. The other problem I vividly recall in diesel, when the prouty and tunnel kilns and frit kilns were fired on diesel, there was always the risk of supply caused by the notorious drivers' union. And there was a secretary there by the name of Bill Anderson, who would, at the drop of a hat, call a strike for all of the tanker drivers, both fuel tank and in those days the beer went in tankers as well. So there would be a mad scramble as to where we could get diesel from. And I recall Fred Hoffman putting me in an Avondale transport truck loaded with 44-gallon drums, driving around Auckland, filling up at the service stations in these 44-gallon drums to get them back. I soon quickly worked out the service stations that had the quick fill pumps, because it'd be out there all day filling 44-gallon drums with diesel to keep the kilns going. I also didn't have a heavy traffic licence at that stage, but Fred said that was just immaterial and just drive the bloody truck. Crown Lynn had the tankage capacity for diesel of only 4 or 5 days total supply. So when the drivers went out, it was really a mad scramble to make sure you had sufficient fuel there to keep the kilns going. The kilns themselves, the tunnel kiln, ran all year with a short break at Christmas time, where a little bit of maintenance could be done on some of the brickwork and the burner ports. Otherwise, it would be running 24/7, 360 days a year. The glossed kilns, or the prouty kilns, firing on diesel again. If I can just go back. The advantage of the tunnel kiln was that the kiln cars were running on rails, which were pushed on a hydraulic ram through the kiln. There was a sand seal skirt on the bottom which prevented the heat from coming down and buckling the rails, and the product was stacked on selimonite slabs, the flatware in stacks of 8 to 10, and the cups inverted onto each other with a wax seal so they'd sit together and contract evenly, so you had a nice round cup instead of a distorted cup to produce the biscuitware. So this was a very efficient kiln. There was insulating aggregate and cement in the kiln top. The prouty kiln, whilst they did a good job, were always prone to kiln crashes because there were no wheels. It worked on a slab running across a slab. So we were pushing a slab through the kiln with the product stacked on top of it. If the pushing slab became rounded on the edge, it would ride up over the next one and product would tumble. And I can recall many times when there was a crash, Fred Hoffman and I would be pushed into the kiln with suitable clothing on to try and grab the product and drag it out. I mean, it was firing at 1,060 degrees, so you couldn't want to stay in there too long. Uh, I was appointed assistant factory manager to Fred Hoffman in 1966, and I became factory manager when Fred was transferred from the pottery to run Tishan out at Takanini. It was a big job. It required long hours, but there were good people there to assist you. And I recall some wonderful times working at Crown Lynn as factory manager. The thing that comes to mind is that Tom Clark would invariably want to visit the factory on a Sunday morning to chew the fat about how production was. He at that stage wasn't based at Crown Lynn, he was down at Ceramic House, so he was a bit removed, but wanted to keep his finger on the pulse as to what the hell was going on. And there was always a conflict between production and sales, so he probably wanted to get my story against what the salespeople were telling about what the factory could or couldn't do. We had some lively discussions on a Sunday morning. It didn't come to blows, but we always parted as good mates. And one thing about Tom is if you made a strong case, then he would give you enough resources and rope to hang yourself, or in the event it didn't work, there were no recriminations. He was a very fair man in that respect. And I really liked the guy. One of the things that Tom and I would regularly clash on was the theory and concept that Crown Lynn was a low-cost producer. My argument was that because of some of the costs in New Zealand that we were facing, Crown Lynn wasn't a low-cost producer. It was all very well being mass producing and low cost to get the benefit of the scale, provided you were making a profit on every piece. If you weren't, then you got the benefit of the scale in the reverse, and the more you produced, the more you lost. And we battled on many occasions with regards to that concept. There's so much I haven't touched on which I go into in terms of the making process and that, but I just wanted to say a little bit about the demise of Crown Lynn Potteries. I left in 1978 and I think I could probably see the writing on the wall as to the way and the direction the company was going to go, and I went out and did things on my own after that. But in a reverse takeover of Ceramco, interests associated with Alan Gibbs and Charles Bidwell, who controlled Atlas Majestic Industries, acquired a controlling interest in Ceramco. The Ceramco conglomerate owned many notable trading companies, including Morris, Black and Matheson, who were the agents for Marquita, Mason Brothers Engineering, Mason Mesco Engineering Supplies, Gibson and Patterson, the wholesalers for all of the institutional vitrified hotel ware in New Zealand and Australia. And Ceramco, apart from the brick pipe works in Crown Lynn, also had huge land holdings throughout the country. There were the pipe and brickworks in Wellington, in Carterton. There was land and clay pits in the north, many of them. And Mr. Gibbs and Bidwell saw value in these assets. They didn't see a lot of value in employing people. And I can recall the time that Tom Clark said that he wanted me to show around a person at Crown Lynn. He said his name's Alan Gibbs. I met Alan at the front door, and I gave Alan a conducted tour and told him all about the operation of the place. He wasn't particularly interested in what I had to say. He was only summing up the buildings that could be demolished and made good for something else, the machinery that could be flogged off, and there were far too many people in the place for his liking. They just didn't want to employ people. But they did see real value in the assets. They saw no value in the labour-intensive industries, companies like Crown Lynn and Amalgamated Brick and Pipe. The new owner's primarily interest was in liquidating assets and not employing staff. Crown Lynn was a foregone tragedy and faced inevitable closure. The assets, worth millions, were disposed of at minimal value to interests in Malaysia in the area of Johor Bahru. The worst aspect of the Crown Lynn closure was the huge superannuation fund, which I believe was never paid out in full to those deserving people. In saying that also, had Crown Lynn continued into the 1990s, the environmental emission standards would have severely impacted on the ability of the business to continue, with the emissions of glazed dust particles, lead vapours from the glass kilns, and sediment control from the wastewater. Remediation costs would preclude the operation continuing on the New Lynn site, and to remediate and to mitigate against those emissions would have been cost prohibitive. That's about, I mean, I could go on for hours, but I think that probably gives you a reasonable insight into my time at Crown Lynn, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
I'll get you a glass of water.
Oh, thank you.
And would you like a stool to sit on?
That's okay.
Can I ask about the specials, the hand-potted and the specials department?
Can I tell you about the
hand-potted pieces and the specials department?
okay,
Where were they
we had a very talented potter in my time there. His name was Daniel Steenstra, well known and well regarded around the country. Daniel was a very, very proficient hand thrower. He could just churn out pieces at an unbelievable rate. Fred never liked the guy and referred to him as lazy bastard. I saw value in Daniel, and I remember getting some pallets of pipe clay from the pipe works, of pipes that had been extruded and squashed flat, and gave this to Daniel to work on. And he produced dozens and dozens of lidded pots and other articles in a day from the pipe clay. We bisque fired those, and we dipped them in a clear glaze and sold them in the Crown Lynn shops and second shops. And we made a lot of money out of Dan. Some of those pots he did in the earthenware body as well, and we glazed those, for example, in a rusticana base with a honey-coloured lid. We did some combinations of bands. Danny often scribed into the face some motives and scribed onto the surface of the ware. Very proficient. In fact, I did meet Danny Steenstra's son a few weeks ago, who's written a book on Danny. And I recall that when Daniel left Crown Lynn, he went to work at a little pottery in the South Island, just out of Darfield, at a place called Colgate. And a friend of mine, Peter Boys, owned the Darfield Brickworks. And he remembers Danny well because his father was a potter from England, and Danny would come around there and discuss clays and things like that. And just up the road from Colgate was a clay pit where a clay called Carcahoo came from. And Danny produced a lot of stuff at Colgate. He was at Colgate, I think, for 8 years, but he was very proficient. There was also a hand thrower, Ernie Shufflebottom, that I did not know. He had left by the time I started at Crown Lynn, Ernie had. But he came out from England. But getting back to Danny, very proficient. Yeah.
Did the demand exceed his supply?
I'm sorry?
Did the demand exceed his supply? Danny Teamster's hand thrown stuff.
Did I demand
The
to...
demand for his work, was it?
Oh, yeah. It was very saleable.
Yeah.
In fact, I gave the Rosemary some pieces.
Yes,
Yeah.
they're not on display at the moment, the pieces you gave.
Yeah.
But there are some others on display.
There are some pieces there that Danny, yeah, very, very skilled thrower. There's no one could beat Danny in churning out lidded pots, bowls, vases, whatever, you name it. And the good thing about Danny was if you gave him a free rein and gave him a bit of praise, he had that rolled up cigarette which would hang out the side of his mouth, and he'd work his little heart out all day long, producing beautiful pieces, extremely saleable.
Yes.
No.
Did he make any of the ones at the back? Did he make those sorts of things, the vases?
The white ones there?
Yeah.
No, they're all cast. They're all cast in a mould. So that's the earthenware body cast in a mould. I can't
The
see.
two on the top shelf on this side are by Danny.
Oh, sorry, I can't see those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about the swans?
I'm sorry?
Can you tell us about the swans?
Yes. There were two swans. The large one, from memory, the number of that was 170, and the small swan was 154. They were cast in the earthenware body and glazed in matte white. Some, I think, were also done in some. There were some black swans produced in a black glaze, and I think some were even produced in a matte white glaze with a lustre. But swans were popular.
Do you have any idea how many of them would have been made?
In the casting, none of the casters in the casting room liked making swans. Because of the big one, the mould was this big. And so it took nearly at least half a bucket of liquid clay, and so the guys would be holding up 50, 60 pounds of liquid clay pouring from a can. That's before we got the reticulated pumped clay which we could dispense from a hose. After the liquid clay had sat in the mould for 20, 25 minutes and formed that skin, the mould had to be physically picked up and leaned over and tipped upside down, where it would drain the surplus liquid clay, then turn back again, the wire removed from the outside. It was a 3-part mould, the two sides and a lock-in base, where it would be taken out and carefully put on a board to harden up and become leather hard, at which stage the seam where the two moulds formed together would be what they call fettled off with a knife, sponged up, and it would be fired.
John, whereabouts did the design come from? Was it an original design, or was it a copy, or
The swan?
the swan?
I don't know. I don't know where it came from. I would presume it's a copy. It was far easier for things to be copied than generate that design. And the designers at Crown Lynn, Dave Jenkins, Mark Cleverley and others, primarily their work was mainly based on decorations, glaze colours and combination of glaze and colour, etc.
With your huge knowledge after, 15 years at Crown Lynn, whereabouts did your career take you? Because, you were there right the way through the evolution of Crown Lynn, and that was a pretty amazing situation.
I left Crown Lynn in '78 and bought an orchard, and then I went into sprout growing and started a shipping company.
Yeah. Okay, so you didn't continue with,
No. I'm
not
never.
even as a hat.
I'd be no good at throwing pots like Danny Stenstra. No.
Do you have a collection of it yourself?
I have. I've given most of it to this place. Yeah, there's no point in me hanging on to it. I'd rather that anything that I had came down here. There's some other satellite parts of Crown Lynn that I haven't touched on. For example, the copper etched plates for the underglaze printing were produced at Decorating Services, which was in a building around the corner in Puri Street in New Lynn. They also produced there all of the silk screen transfers. They produced transfers like that, which were inglaze transfers. They didn't produce those, that's a lithographic transfer, but they produced a huge range of silk screen transfers which were applied either normally on glaze, some of them were underglaze, which were fired off, which were pre-fired before they were glazed, but that was a big department. So they had the photographic, they could etch the copper plates. Those copper plates were then hard chromed at CAC Industries. That was a big department, and it allowed Crown Lynn to become very self-sufficient in sourcing decorations at the time that had been created either through the design competition or through Mark Cleverley and Dave Jenkins, both very talented designers in their own right.
Can you remember what the swans sold for when they were originally produced?
I don't, I can't, but it wouldn't have been more than,
I was earning $28 a week there.
I mean, it wouldn't have been any more than a 20-piece dinner set for years and years and years. The ex-factory price was $12.95 for a 20-piece dinner set. So I would imagine that the swans were selling for $2. A bit different to the $1,000 something you pay now.
Can I tell a swan story?
Hmm?
Can I tell a swan story?
Sure.
I'm Dave Jenkins' son. I think Dad actually made it, but I think Tom said, here's a swan that he brought back from England.
Yeah.
Copy that. Is that right, Rose?
Yeah, I think it was a silverback swan that Tom brought back and gave to Dave. Dave made a model.
Yeah.
There's a model on display.
Yeah, so he would have carved it up.
The one who would have made the model would have been Tam Mitchell.
Right.
Tam was the modeller. Very talented too. Extremely talented. Tam would have made the model, and then from that model there would have been a block and case produced, and from that block and case you make your moulds. You're Dave's son. Hello.
I haven't seen you since I was about 9. I used to go down and wander around the potteries.
All right. Yeah.
I don't really remember you so much. Maybe you were to come the next day to see Tom. We were the Saturday, me and
Yeah.
Clark.
Yeah.
Dad was heartbroken at the end of Crown Lynn. He really was.
Yes. Yes. Dave had been there a long time.
Yeah. But it was the end of the industry.
Yes.
And when you say that Alan Gibbs wandered through with you and was looking at the assets and could see the value in the land all over the country, I'm not here to sort of justify what happened there, but maybe that environmental thing that you referred to later on, the writing was on the wall that this industry could not continue here in New Lynn because of all those environmental issues that they were about to face. Do you think Ian Gibbs knew about that?
No. He wouldn't have. He was after dollars and cents. He wouldn't be so concerned about the contamination of the wastewater going into the clay pit at the back and travelling under the man-made the hole. There was a tunnel hand dug from the back of the clay pit all the way through under Ashley Avenue there.
Right.
I mean, that's where our wastewater went.
Yeah.
He would all the exhaust from the kilns or the glaze machines or anything like that. He was involved in. He was looking at dollars and cents, and through his involvement in terms of telecom, the New Zealand Forest Service and things like that, it was a case of he came in at the right time with Rodgenomics and just liquidate those assets, set up some standalone publicly owned companies, and he's now based in Detroit.
Right.
When did it all finish? The Crown Lynn
When did
journey? When did it finish?
in the 1986, was it?
May 89.
May 89, yes.
Yeah.
There's a man who's sitting with us today, that guy there with the cap on, he's the one who switched the lights off at the last, I think.
Last to leave, yeah.
That's Tom Clark,
Oh,
Tom's nephew.
ah, right.
Yeah, I think Tom switched the lights off.
Well,
John, import licensing was against them at the end also. They
True.
were very much protected. You couldn't import cup saucers and plates. It was like the no remittance when you bought a car. You had to have the funds.
Yes.
And very
Yes.
much protected Crown Lynn as it grew.
I did go back to Crown Lynn for an 8-month period in 1981. I was invited to go back there as commercial manager on a very short contract. After I had left, there were a succession of general managers, and I could be stand corrected, but I don't think any of them contributed much to the future of Crown Lynn. They all wanted to bring in change for the sake of change, whether it be good or bad. And I know I went back there, and one thing I was pleased to achieve was getting the price of a 20-piece dinner set up to Woolworths and Farmers at $19.95, away from that $14.95 bracket. But when it comes to import substitution and that, I can recall in the late 60s when Tom took out a full-page advert in every paper in New Zealand. It was a whole page. New Zealand Herald, New Zealand, Auckland Star, all the papers right throughout the South Island, trying to impress upon the government that we needed some income protection. And this was not just for Crown Lynn, but for good companies like Fisher and Paykel, the manufacturing companies that needed that secure domestic market in order to expand and produce product for the overseas markets and export. And Tom was fought minister after minister in both Labor and National to get that level of import protection that we so deserved. He wasn't against bone china coming in because it was something we weren't producing. That came in free. It was that threshold price for dinnerware and institutional hotelware that Crown Lynn required some level of protection for. And I mean, is Mrs. Housewife in New Zealand any better off when Crown Lynn closed? No. Suddenly there was no more replaceability. Dinnerware came in from Korea, Sri Lanka. Japan became a little bit too expensive. There weren't many cheap manufacturers in Japan. They had upmarket like the Mikases and the Noritake. You know, that was expensive product. But Bangladesh, they've got pretty cheap labour there, and Thailand, Vietnam, these countries flooded crappy product in here in terms of 20-piece sets.
what was the story with Crown Lynn in the Philippines? You see sometimes pieces
yes.
that say Crown Lynn Philippines.
There was a joint venture, but in the Philippines, the factory, the company was known as Mayon Ceramics, and they produced an earthenware body. All of the equipment in the factory at Mayon Ceramics was manufactured at the Crown Lynn engineering plant around in Puri Street. So all of the semi-automatic flatware, cut machines, the dryers, the Murray Kervics, the printing machines, everything was produced here in New Zealand and shipped across. There was nothing the matter with the product. The problem being that Mayon was set up, the business was set up to supply some of the local market, but predominantly the market in Canada and the States. And being an earthenware body, there was huge competition in the States competing against that Mayon product going in there. The other disadvantage is that the big buyers in the States have a fixation that if it comes from the Philippines, there's low labour costs, it's got to be cheap. Regardless of how it looked, the quality of the decoration, the quality of the product, they're expecting a discounted price for it. So you're always on the back foot from day one. In fact, Tommy, his brother Simon, he was marketing that product in the States, the Mayon product in the States, along with the product from Royal Grafton, the bone china product from Stoke-on-Trent that Crown Lynn also owned. Yes.
Did you go away with the trips that went to Europe and Stoke-on-Trent?
Yes, I did.
Did you go away with Dad?
No, I didn't go with your dad.
Oh.
I went one trip to Stoke-on-Trent. I went with the engineer Ross Bruin through Stoke-on-Trent in Germany to look at that. I also was sent. Crown Lynn had secured the management contract for a factory in Singapore called Starlight Ceramic Industries, and it was situated in the Geelong Industrial Estate. And I vividly recall Arthur Turner, who was the director of Ceramco, approached me on Boxing Day, one Christmas. I was working through the Christmas with Fred Hoffman, and he said, Tom's approved for you to go straight up to Starlight Ceramics in Singapore. We have a management contract to run the place. The business was set up by an Indonesian crook by the name of Sterling Wong, and every piece of equipment in the whole factory, it was a big plant, a very big plant. Arthur told me there was between 200 and 300 people working in the place. I got there and there were 700. They produced a hard-faced porcelain, a good product, a very good product. The problem was that the business had been funded by the Singapore Factory Development Corporation and the Chartered Bank from England. After 8 months, the Chartered Bank approached 2 or 3 potteries in the UK, in the Stoke-on-Trent area, one being Johnson Brothers, and I know the other one was J&J Meekins, who visited Starlight, and I was asked to show them around, and I quickly realised what they were there for. They did express some interest in buying the place, and the Chartered Bank decided to liquidate, and I was asked to shut the kilns down. I said, well, if you shut them down, you'll lose the staff. You'll never start it again. Oh, no. These people know what they're doing. I said, well, I'll shut it down if that's what you need. And I came home, shut the place down, but it never turned again. I went back there a few years later and bought some equipment, some bowl making machines and other things for Crown Lynn. But just a shame. Yes?
You're vitrifying and your earthenware in the same kiln at the same time, is that right? So you find the same thing?
Vitrified and earthenware in the same kiln at the same time.
And what temperature are you firing to?
In the biscuit kiln, 1160 degrees, or in the gloss kiln, 960 degrees.
Oh, yeah.
But the composition of the body, the vitrified or hotelware body, the porcelain body, had fluxes in it which would fuse together, so it had zero porosity. So it was a glassy matrix. Unfortunately, it wasn't the best in terms of being oven-proof, because it would be more susceptible to thermal shock. It wasn't a perfect ovenware body in terms of casseroles or bakers, but it was generally okay. But not as good as a specially designed ovenware body, but the two bodies were fired together in the same kiln.
Yeah.
The earthenware was porous, a porous body, and I mean, the typical way to measure the porosity was to pick up the biscuit plate and put your tongue on it, and the little bit of suck that you got with the plate sucking the saliva off your tongue determined the porosity.
Very high tech.
Did you ever meet Dorothy Thorpe?
Yes,
What was she like?
she brought out the most. Well, I mean, she came up with the design for balls on the cups, the handles. I mean, the most difficult thing to hold a hot cup of tea, and the cups that were designed were quite large in diameter.
Yeah.
And when all the tea slopped this way, invariably with a smooth cup, people would spill it. I mean, it was a gimmick, I suppose. It was certainly different. There was nothing in the ceramic product range anywhere in the world like it. There were some nice designs, I'll give her that. There were some nice designs. Our failing was that we didn't have the salespeople in the States who knew how to sell
Right.
and drive a hard bargain and get the prices and get the volumes. There was nothing matter with the product that was produced. It was our ability to market and sell the product and get the price for it. And the Dorothy Thorpe range expired as a consequence.
So there wasn't many made?
Oh, there was a lot made.
Of the
Oh, yeah.
ball-handled ones?
With the,
The ball-handled ones?
oh yeah, it was all ball handled.
Right.
All of her range was ball handled cups. Yeah. And I think
She
ball
did
handled.
have other handles though that went like that, didn't they?
Oh yes, sorry, there were some others. Yes, there were.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, the ball handle was just bloody ridiculous. And
Very sought after.
I mean,
now.
it's difficult enough to stick the cup handle on.
Yeah.
You've got a jiggered body of a cup without a handle. The handle is cast, and that handle's got to be cut so the radius goes that way as well as the radius going this way on a curve-shaped cup. So it's a very tricky little machine which you put the handle in, press the lever, and it cuts it. That's then got to be a slight application of liquid clay put on the clay handle, stuck to the cup, wiped round and podged with a stick and a brush, and fired. I mean, people used to say, "Oh, Crown Lynn cup handles fall off." They don't. I mean, Tom Clark used to. I've seen him when we've been out to dinner and someone said, "Oh, you know, this stuff's better than yours," and he'll pick up a piece of our vitrified cup and smash it against the other one, knock the handles off every time. He's the delight in it. There was nothing that Crown Lynn handles don't fall off. Sure, the railway cups that used to litter the side of the railways around New Zealand.
Yeah.
I mean, the handles did fall off after they were thrown out the window of the railway wagon. And that railway cup, incidentally, for those that you may not know, is the rounded railway cup with a big heavy block handle on it, is the same cup that's used for a 30 amp insulator on the power poles. So the 30 amp insulator is the cup body, and with a handle on, it's the 700, the number 700. Yeah.
What about the, is it Wharetana, the Māori designed like
Yes,
X-rays and stuff?
that was there was a little bit of that done when I started with the brown glazes on it. Extremely collectible now, very collectible, and good stuff. But there's nothing special about it. I mean, it's just the earthenware body with a brown glaze. But there were some nice motives on it. There were some nice Maori, shapes, the walkers and the bowls and things like that. Quite good. Yep.
Who designed those?
Sorry?
Who designed the Wharetani ware?
I don't know. I don't know who designed that.
I think it was Dave Jenkins.
Oh,
And Harry Hargreaves carved them
okay.
and made the models. He was a modeller. Any more questions?
John, just a comment.
Yes, Graham.
I was a cadet.
Yes.
And I can well recall, I don't know whether people from around here know about Ceramco House, which was the head office, of course, for
Yes.
Crown Lynn, and it was the pride of
Yes.
New Lynn, of Auckland really, a very tall brick building,
Yes,
and bricks couldn't in those days be used for tall buildings, but they elected. My intrigue was that one whole floor was a computer.
yes,
And I look now and I would reckon that the cell phone in my pocket has probably got 10 times the power of that computer.
Yes,
That
yes.
was, and the building was specifically built to house on one floor that
Yes.
computer.
In fact, that building was octagonal or hexagonal in shape,
That's right.
with those wings coming out of it,
Yeah.
with the buff Roman bricks, made of the buff Roman bricks. And the floors of that building were constructed using Stahlton. The Stahlton is a extruded tile shape which has high tensile wire stretched through it and concrete pumped into it, so it's a pre-stressed beam. And you're quite right, that big mainframe computer that went in there, the first computer was actually installed where the work study office was at Crown Lynn. Eric Manser ran that, and then he shifted down to Ceramic House. But I can vividly remember that monstrous great big mainframe computer, and I can remember Tom Clark saying, "One day, son," he said, "a thing this size in your hand will have the capacity of that." And I said, "Oh yeah. So, you know, that's going back 50, 60 years.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
Which is quite a short time really.
yeah. Yeah, it was Ceramco House. I remember it was designed by Neville Price.
Neville Price.
Neville Price, yes.
For those that are interested or don't know where it is or what it is, you go through the entrance to Ceramco House now, and there is still one last little bit of Crown Lynn hanging on the wall there, and it's a mural a Dad did, and it tells the story of that cart there that you're standing next to. Do you know the one I mean? That mural? You know, it's a scene of those carts going through the kiln,
All right.
and it's done in pieces of tile like this.
Yes,
And they were done up at Carmo.
yes,
And I was up there as a kid, and Dad was drawing
Yes.
these things up. So that's the last little piece of Crown Lynn in that building there.
yeah. That came from Carmo Refractory Works.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So it's still there.
Yes.
You can still go up if you want to see a little bit of Crown Lynn. It's still hanging up in the foyer there. It's kind of a neat image, actually.
Yes. Yes.
It's the story of you, really. It's the production
Yeah.
idea of the
Yes.
machine, you know.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I've got one of those statues opened by J.R. Marshall, the opening of Ceramco House down here. I've got it home now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, thank you very much, John. It
That's
was
brilliant.
amazing.
Thank you all
Thank you very much.
for listening.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great.
Very interesting.